Hey, AP World History Scholars! I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher, and on this channel we will be covering everything AP World History to get you ready for the big exam in May. If you're new here, please make sure and subscribe and click the notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. I hear it's time to review period 5, so that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Before I get started, go ahead and click on the link below in the description that links you to a Google document. That will have an overview of everything that we're going to be talking about in this video. That way you can take some notes as you listen. Alright, well, here we go. So the first thing we covered in period 5 was revolutions, where the context of the revolutions would be the Enlightenment. All the thinkers start to think and question whether or not monarchy is really the best way to go, or is there a better way? That's what they start to think. So you want to remember people like John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, and even some women got in on the Enlightenment. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft did some writing. My class uses Ways of the World, but if you have a different textbook, just look it up in the index. Ways of the World pages are on the Google Doc. There's also a website that's great that you can look at for review and for some extra resources on the Enlightenment, just to refresh your memory about that. Alright, so let's get started on the revolutions. The first one is the American Revolution. You should be pretty familiar with this one. Growing up in America, we talk about it a lot. Alright, so a quick overview of the American Revolution. We know from the colonists' point of view, they think that the British are taxing them too much and that they should have more access to government. And the British aren't allowing that. This ends up starting a war we call the American Revolution, where the Americans end up winning their freedom from the British. So what's the impact of this? Well, it was the first time that colonies had ever successfully overthrown the colonial power. This spreads the fire of wanting to be free throughout the world, and people start to find hope in the fact that the Americans were able to do that. The American Revolution also has strong influences from the Enlightenment. For example, liberty, justice, inalienable rights, which are the rights that can't be taken away, popular sovereignty, which is the right to vote, social contracts between the people and the government. Our founding fathers were huge readers, huge scholars on everything that the Enlightenment thinkers wrote, and they definitely use those ideals in our documents, such as the Declaration of Independence and even the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In our government today, you can also see separation of powers. That has strong ties to the Enlightenment as well. And in general, our basic freedoms are all things that Enlightenment thinkers fought for and wrote about. The American Revolution just ignites the world in this revolutionary type spirit, and the French Revolution is next. So the context for the French Revolution would be the Enlightenment as well as the American Revolution. You see this pattern? It's kind of a domino effect. So the overview of the French Revolution is that there are 3 estates. The first and second estate are the top. They're the upper class. They don't pay very much in taxes, but they make the most money. The third estate is the majority. They pay the majority of taxes, they're also the biggest group, and they make the least amount of money. So you can see why they might be upset. And then you add the king and queen to that. Marie Antoinette with her fabulous hairstyles and dresses and wanting to add on to Versailles, and the king adding to that debt with wars. And so you can see the people have a reason to be upset. And then once propaganda spreads and the people are starving, that ignites the revolution in France. After the revolution, we know that the king and queen are beheaded, and Robespierre takes over in what's called the Reign of Terror. And he starts to behead people who are up against him. He also starts to really distrust the revolutionaries, and he kind of makes them play against each other. Eventually, they think that he's crazy, they behead him, and Napoleon takes over and starts trying to conquer the world. So they got rid of the monarchy, had Robespierre for a little while where everything was just scary and everyone was getting beheaded. And then they had Napoleon, who pretty much sets himself up as emperor. So they don't really ever get rid of a king. The French Revolution is also influenced by the Enlightenment, by liberty and alienable rights, and just basic freedoms, as well as a very important document that we looked at excerpts from, the Declaration of the Citizen and the Rights of Man. That's influenced very much by the Enlightenment as well as the Declaration of Independence. And so the French really look at the American Revolution for their inspiration as well. Okay, you'll notice on your Google document, there's a document practice by Maximilien Robespierre himself. So let me hop over to my iPad, we'll read that document, and then we'll get back to the rest of period 5. Okay, so let's look at our first document about the French Revolution. This one is by Maximilien Robespierre, and it's a report on the principles of revolutionary government, 1793. The revolutionary government is the cause of the fear of the aristocracy, or the pretext for its calumniaries, making false statements to destroy someone's reputation. For the tyrants, this government is a scandal. For most people, it is a miracle. It must be explained to all so that at least all citizens may be rallied around the principles of the general will. The goal of a constitutional government is the protection of the republic. That of a revolutionary government is the establishment of the republic. Foreign courts have for some time been spewing out on French soil their well-paid criminals. Their agents still infect our armies. All the bravery of our soldiers, all the devotion of our generals, and all the heroism of the members of this assembly had to be put forth to defeat treason. These gentlemen still speak in our administrative bodies. In the various sections, they secure admission to the clubs. They sometimes may be found sitting among us. They lead the counter-revolution. They lurk about us. They eavesdrop on our secrets. They flatter our passions and seek even to influence our opinions and to turn our decisions against us. If we spare them, they will conspire publicly. If we threaten them, they will conspire secretly or under the mask of patriotism. Our only possible answer to their pamphlets and lies is to destroy them. Okay, so what's he talking about here? Well, basically, he's saying there are still people among us that are not for us, that are counter the revolution. So he talks about how the revolutionary government is the cause of fear for the aristocracy. So let's underline that, the cause of fear. So basically, aristocracy, who are they? Well, those are the rich. Those are the ones that the revolution is trying to put down, right? And he says that they fear the revolution. They fear our government. Well, why? Because they don't want to lose their power, right? Then it says, for the tyrants, this government is a scandal. For most people, it is a miracle. It must be explained to all so that at least all good citizens may be rallied around the principle of goodwill. He talks about down here, this is important, he says, all the bravery of our soldiers, all the devotion of our general, all the heroism of the members of this assembly had put forth to defeat treason. That's what they're trying to do, right? These gentlemen speak in their administrative bodies and the various sections they secure to administer in the clubs, and they can sometimes be found around among us. They lead counter-revolution. That means they're going against the revolution. They lurk about us. They eavesdrop, so they're very sneaky. He's trying to get that point across. They flatter with our passions and seek even to influence our opinions. So they're looking to try to change the revolution and get people to be influenced. They conspire publicly. So what is he trying to do here? What is the purpose of what he's writing about? We know from our knowledge of world history that Robespierre led what was called the Reign of Terror, right? I would put down beside this justification for the Reign of Terror because basically he's trying to question whether or not revolutionaries can all be trusted. Are there some that conspire publicly against us? There might be. There might be some of them that even threaten us, and that they are conspiring secretly under the mask of patriotism, that they're trying to tell us that, hey, we're here for the right reasons, we support you, but maybe they're actually not. So you can put down that he's kind of talking about why it's important to cut their heads off during the Reign of Terror, right? Why it's important to be suspect of different revolutionaries, because they might not all be in it for the right reasons. And that is your document on Robespierre. Okay, so after the French Revolution, we have the Haitian Revolution. Haiti is a colony of France, remember? And when the French overthrow the monarchy, the French who are in Haiti think, maybe we should be free too, because all these profits should be ours. Also, Haiti is a little bit more complex because there's a huge slave population, and the slaves start to think, maybe we should be free as well. There's also a population of mixed people who want rights as well. And so the whole population of Haiti is just really thinking, maybe we should have more rights. Maybe we should be free. And that's kind of what sparks the Haitian Revolution, wanting to be free of the French. The context of the Haitian Revolution is, of course, the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, as well as the French Revolution. They look at all of those as hope for the future, that they can actually do it and earn their freedom. The impact of this one is that it's the first successful slave rebellion. That spreads throughout the world, and it scares other places where slavery is still going on, including the Americas. Slave owners everywhere are worried that this rebellion will cause their slaves to rebel as well. And last but not least, from 1811 to about 1830, there were a ton of revolutions in South America. This happens because Napoleon conquered Spain and Portugal, got rid of their monarchies, and now the Latin American countries had a chance for freedom as well. And so during that time span, they were fighting for their freedom in Latin America. However, the impact of these revolutions is a little bit different. They don't progress, they don't become stable governments, and they become very impoverished, which is different than the American and the French Revolution and how they played out. So remember, the context of all these revolutions really has strong ties to the Enlightenment. And the fact that people were starting to look more towards science and a little bit less towards God. The whole idea that the kings had a divine right to rule because God set them up is something that's starting to be questioned during the Enlightenment, and that continues to be questioned throughout the revolutions. We also see something else pop up. It's called nationalism, and this is inspired by the revolutions. Prior to nationalism, remember, people lived in very small areas, they mostly stuck to their communities, and now they're starting to move to cities and urbanizing. And because of that, they have a little bit less loyalty to their little community areas. Printing makes knowledge a little bit more accessible, and a lot more people read. They also get to read in their own local language. So that's another thing that starts tying people together, is the fact that they speak the same language. Out of this comes the unification of Germany, as well as Italy, and some other places in Europe. And people in Europe start to think of themselves as a nation, as a whole, that identifies together with certain language and characteristics. On your Google document, we have another document to practice. So let's hop on over and check that one out. Our next document is written by this guy right here, and it's an address to the German nation in 1806. We know that is around the time of the unification of Germany, so this document probably has to do with that. Let's look at it. It says, the first original and truly natural boundaries of states are beyond doubt their internal boundaries. Those who speak the same language are joined to each other by a multitude of invisible bonds by nature herself. Long before any human art begins, they understand each other and have the power of continuing to make themselves understood more and more clearly. They belong together and are by nature one and inseparably whole. So what combines people as far as internal boundaries? Number one is language. Such a whole, if it wishes to absorb and mingle with itself any other people of different descent and language, cannot do so without itself becoming confused. In the beginning, at any rate, and violently disturbing the even progress of culture. From this internal boundary, which is drawn by the spiritual nature of man itself, the marking of external boundary by dwelling place results as a consequence. So he's saying first it starts with the language and this internal boundary, and then the external boundaries are drawn. And in the natural view of things, it is not because men dwell between certain mountains and rivers that they are a people. But on the contrary, men dwell together, and if their luck has so arranged it, are protected by rivers and mountains, because they were a people already by the law of nature, which is much higher. Thus, the German nation, placed sufficiently united within itself by a common language and a common way of thinking, and sharply even severed from other peoples in the middle of Europe as a wall to divide races not akin. So what's he saying? Well, basically he's saying first you are joined together by your language, and then after that you're joined together by your boundaries. So what is this describing? One word: nationalism, right? He's talking about how, hey, we're all the same people because of our language that combines us and our culture that combines us. So nationalism. It's a feeling because we have a common culture, we should just automatically also have a common territory.
So the main point from this document is nationalism and how it comes into play as Germany unifies.
Okay, now we need to talk about the Industrial Revolution. So the context of the Industrial Revolution is that the enclosure movement happens. Do you remember the enclosure movement? Well, let me refresh your memory. The enclosure movement was when large farmers started buying up smaller farms and making these big, large farms. The smaller farmers would then move into the cities looking for jobs. Well, there had to be jobs there, right? Also, Great Britain has resources that are coming in to kind of spur on this industrial revolution, such as textiles and cotton, as well as Great Britain has a government that really supports economic innovation. All of these factors together create this perfect situation for Europe to industrialize, and so that's what they do. Now, the effects of this, for the most part, are not very good. It results in very crowded cities, very unsanitary cities, the lower classes working long, boring hours in factories, and we also see a lot of child labor, which is not good. From this, we also find some new economies kind of coming out. For example, capitalism. Adam Smith writes about this in The Wealth of Nations. He believes that the world benefits most from free trade, where the government isn't very involved. It's called laissez-faire economics, where the government just kind of lets trade be. That is Adam Smith's opinion of what is the most successful form of an economy, a capitalist economy basically. On the other hand, we see another type of economy develop. This one's by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx says that because of the class struggle between the upper class, which is the bourgeoisie, and the lower class, which is the proletariat, there's no way that a capitalist society can continue to exist. Eventually, there's going to be a class war, and capitalists will be no more. And in that time, society will go to a communist type society, where everyone is equal, and in a true communist society, money wouldn't even be needed because everyone has just enough of what they need. Friedrich Engels is also a supporter of Marx, and he agrees a lot with Marx. They end up writing the Communist Manifesto. You have an excerpt of that on your Google form. Let's check that one out.
Okay, the next two documents we have, one is by Karl Marx, and it's from the Communist Manifesto, and the next one is Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. So we already know that they are not going to agree, right? Because we have the communist against the capitalist. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That's what we were talking about earlier. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, this would be Rome, remember? Lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another. So here's this constant class struggle. Carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. So now it's open, and that each time ended either in revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of contending classes. So he's saying it always ends in a revolution or the ruin of these classes. That's how it always ends. So basically he's saying society always wants to alter this. No one is happy in this type of society. So put that down. Always fighting against this. Always fighting the class struggle. Now, the tone of his document is reflected in the Industrial Revolution, right? We see that people are not really that happy during the Industrial Revolution, especially the lower classes. So I would make a note here, Industrial Revolution, and just know that his ideas kind of stem from that because he's looking at how these people are suffering and he's like, there's got to be a better way. Okay, let's look at the next one. Adam Smith says, a country that has no mines of its own must undoubtedly draw its gold and silver from foreign countries, in the same manner as one that has no vineyards of its own must draw its wines. It does not seem necessary, however, that the attention of the government should be more turned toward the one than towards the other object. A country that has wherewithal to buy wine will always get wine which it has occasion for, and a country that has the wherewithal to buy gold and silver will never be in want of these metals. They are to be bought for a certain price like all other commodities. And as they are that price of all other commodities, so all other commodities are the price of those metals. So basically what he's saying is whatever the countries want, they should be able to buy, but we trust with perfect security that the freedom of trade, without any attention from the government, so the government should not have any say on trade, will always supply us with wine which we have occasion for, and we may trust with equal security that it will always supply us with gold or silver which we can afford to purchase or to employ, either in circulating our commodities or in other uses. So he's basically saying that if we have free trade and the government's not messing with it, we'll always be able to get what we want, or we'll always have access. Okay? So what's the main idea here? He always wants people to have access, and he's saying everyone will have access if the government is not involved. So free trade. Make sure you make note of that. He wants people to have free trade and access to these goods with very little government involvement. He's also going to support a free market. What does that mean? Well, prices that will vary based on supply and demand. Remember we talked about that? And that relationship between supply and demand is important. If there's a high supply and a low demand, then you're going to be able to get it for cheaper because not as many people want it. If there is a high demand and a low supply, it's going to be more expensive. All right, so that relationship is very important in the free market economy. Another word that's important to remember is the laissez-faire type of trade. Okay, laissez-faire economics, which basically just means that the government has very little involvement. And Great Britain kind of takes this idea and uses it during the Industrial Revolution. They don't really let the government have so much involvement. It's more based on the industry.
Eventually, the Industrial Revolution leads to imperialism. Why is that? Well, there's a need for more resources. And who has those resources? Other countries outside of Europe. Also, in 1833, slavery is abolished in Great Britain. And this kind of spurs them on to go and do their calling and help the natives who cannot help themselves. You'll see this later when we read The White Man's Burden. And because of all of this and this need for more resources, the scramble for Africa begins. In 1884, European countries hold the Berlin Conference. There are several European countries included in that conference, but there are no African leaders there. This will cause problems later because the Europeans divide up Africa in the way that they want. They don't look at the cultural tribal lines, and this mixes people up in a way that will definitely cause problems. So we see several effects of imperialism. There is infrastructure that's built, such as canals and bridges. However, the treatment of the natives is really, really bad. And if you've read the book that I suggested, King Leopold's Ghost, you see the treatment in the Congo is one of the worst, especially when it's discovered how to harden rubber, because then rubber becomes one of the biggest raw materials that Europeans are after. And guess what? Congo has a lot of it. And they continue to go into the Congo and take it. Also, remember, they're not treating the natives very well. In fact, many die as a result of imperialism instead of being helped. And on your Google Doc, we have 3 different passages that we're going to now compare.
Okay, now we're going to look at some passages concerning imperialism and kind of compare them. So we have the first one, which is from The White Man's Burden. And that one goes down to here. And then passage 2 is The Real White Man's Burden. And passage 3 is The Black Man's Burden. So let's take a look at those and kind of compare them. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve the captive's need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught soul and peoples, half devil, half child. So we said before that it is their duty, right? It's like a duty of the white man to go and civilize these half-human, like they're not even fully human. Take up the white man's burden, that would be the white man's burden right there, to reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. So basically he's saying, you know, what you're going to end up reaping or getting is this reward of they're not really going to like you, and they're going to kind of hate you, but you're going to make their lives better. And so even though you're hated, it is your burden to go and civilize. And remember, this one is 1819, and it's by Rudyard Kipling. Okay, so let's compare it to the next two passages. Passage 2 says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth your sturdy kin, and load them down with Bibles and cannonballs and gin. Throw in a few diseases to spread the tropic climes, for there the healthy natives are quite behind the times." So this one's from an American poet, okay? It happens in 1902, and he's saying this is the real white man's burden. So this is the truth of it. You're taking your Bibles, don't forget the cotton balls don't forget the cannonballs because you have to fight them, right? And the gin and all your diseases. And look at these natives. You're helping healthy natives who are behind the times, right? He's kind of making fun of the fact that up here they're saying, hey, we're going to make their lives better. But did they make their lives better? So put that beside that. Did they make it better? No, they really didn't. In most regards, right? We do see some infrastructure being built, but is that worth all the hurt that they brought to the Africans? I don't know. That's kind of up to your opinion. All right, then passage number 3 is 1920, so it's a little bit later, and it's an English journalist, and this is the black man's perspective. And he says, "But what the partial occupation of African soil by the white men has failed to do, what the mapping out of European political spheres of influences has failed to do." Spheres of influence is just like an area that you're taking over and you're kind of influencing. "What the Maxim, the first machine gun, 1884, and the rifle, the slave gang, labor in the bowels of the earth, and the lash have failed to do, what imported measles, smallpox, and syphilis have failed to do, what even the overseas slave trade failed to do, the power of modern capitalist exploitation, assisted by the modern engines of destruction, may yet succeed in accomplishing." So here he's really talking about the effects of colonialism, right? All of these bad things right here happened. But he said the worst thing, what all of these bad things failed to do, the power of modern capitalistic exploitation, assisted by modern engines of destruction, may succeed in accomplishing. Okay, what's he talking about here? The modern capitalistic exploitation. Well, the fact that they're taking everything, they're exploiting and using the resources from Africa and not really paying the Africans for it, and using modern forms of destruction, he says this is going to kind of be the thing that might succeed in accomplishing their goal. Well, what do you think he's talking about the goal was? You can kind of infer a little bit because we know that imperialism takes away African culture. It puts tribes together that had formerly hated each other, so it causes a whole bunch of problems with that. And so he's saying basically out of all of these things that have happened, the exploitation is the worst. These passages definitely reflect imperialism. They all have to do with that. So I would label that imperialism so that you remember all these have to do with that. Now, the author of the second definitely contradicts the first, right? The second is talking about, hey, did you actually make it better? And so this one is kind of talking about the negative impact, while this one has more of a positive spin. This one right here is like, you know what? All of these things here were horrible. But the capitalist exploitation is probably the worst. Remember, he is an author and a politician and a journalist in England, so he's probably trying to get them to invest in actually helping these people. And instead of trying to exploit them, put the investments in helping African people, or you're going to end up losing your workforce because of all of these things that you're doing to them. And remember, Africa was different. They didn't go in there and really colonize. They went in there and they just were taking resources. They didn't really send over a workforce. They used the Africans as their workforce. So if they destroy that workforce, then they're not really going to have anybody to do that work. Passage 4 is from Aquino. He's a former slave, and this is a case against the slave trade in 1789. So this is before slave trade was abolished. He says the commercial intercourse for Africa opens an inexhaustible source of wealth to the manufacturing interest of Great Britain, and to all which the slave trade is an objection. So he's saying, listen, we have an inexhaustible source of wealth to your manufacturing interest in Great Britain, but the slave trade is going to harm that. The slave trade is not going to allow you to go in there and get all of this wealth. If I am not misinformed, the manufacturing interest is equal, if not superior, to landed interest as to the value for reasons which will soon appear. The abolition of slavery will give a most rapid extension of manufactures, which is totally and diabolically opposite to what some interested people assert. Population, the bowels and the surface of Africa abound in valuable and useful returns. The hidden treasures of centuries will be brought to light and into circulation. Industry, enterprise, and mining will have their full scope, proportional as they civilize. In a word, it lays open an endless field of commerce to the British manufacturers and merchant adventurers. So he's basically saying, if you stop the slave trade and you abandon that, you're going to go in and you're going to be able to have a manufacturing interest in Africa. But the way that it is right now, you're using the people as slaves instead of extending your abilities to manufacture and use the resources in Africa. So remember, some of the abolitionists were using this as a reason that, hey, instead of exploiting the Africans and using them as slaves, let's work with them for manufacturing purpose and, of course, more profit. And that's what he's trying to get across here. So I'm sure he would not support what actually happened with imperialism and how horrible the Africans were treated, because he himself is a former slave. But he's trying to make a case for, hey, if you end the slave trade and start working with the Africans, you can make an economic profit. And so this would probably support the fact that England will eventually abolish slavery because they want to go in and take the resources, right? They're not necessarily working alongside the Africans to make it better. They're exploiting them, which is not the case that Aquino would have wanted, but they've ended the slave trade, which is what he's trying to get them to do here. This is his purpose, because we see that in the title right here. So if the purpose is to end the slave trade, he's playing to the crowd, the British, and saying, hey, you're going to make more profit if you do this. Our next document is from India, and it is written by Bartle Frey, a British governor of the Bombay Presidency, about the railway, and it's a speech opening the railway in 1863. And it says, I can safely say that before the commencement of what I call the railway period, commencement just means start, not only were the wages in most parts of the country established by tradition and authority, rather than by natural law of supply and demand, but the opportunity to work was in general restricted to particular parts. For the first time in history, the Indian finds that he has in his power of labor a valuable possession, which, if he uses it right, will give him something much better than mere subsistence. That means he can make more money than just survival. Follow him to his own home in some remote village, and you will find that the railway laborer has carried to his own village not only new modes of working, new wants and new feelings of self-respect and independence, but new ideas of what government and laws can offer him. And he is, I believe, a better, more loyal subject, as he is certainly a more useful laborer. So basically he's saying, because we've come in and we've provided work for the Indians, now they have more choices. Now they have more freedom. Now they're more respected because they are working, and they can take all of that back to their village. And he says because of this, he has loyal subjects and useful laborers because he's kind of put them to work. So basically, it's the British government saying, hey, look at what we've done for you. We've really helped you out. We've given you jobs. by putting in the railway and provided faster transport of people and goods, right? So here's the benefits of what we have done. What would the context of this be? Well, this is the context. Imperialism, right? Imperialism going in and putting in these railroads. These are the benefits that we have done for you. And then he even talks about how they've lifted the old law established by tradition and authority. So we went against the tradition and authority which was restricting you, right? It wasn't good. Now we're giving you more opportunity to work. So he's kind of putting a positive spin on it and saying, hey, we have come here and we've helped you, we've rescued you, and all of those things support European imperialism, right? Because it shows the superiority of the British. That's what he's trying to get across in this speech. What do you think he means by the railroad period that he talks about here? Well, that would just simply mean opening up new markets and adding access to different things, being able to get resources out there for the commercial interests that the British have. Now, we remember that all the trade is run by the British East India Company, right? So he is talking about these changing opportunities in relation to state-sponsored trading companies, such as the British East India Trade Company. And he definitely is supporting that because it's giving these new opportunities. So in the last sentence of the speech, he says, and he is, I believe, a better, more loyal subject, as he is certainly a more useful laborer. He's saying Indians appreciate the fact that we have put them to work and we've given them this opportunity. Because we have helped the Indians, they're going to be a more loyal subject to us and therefore a useful laborer. But this, in fact, did not happen. Because of improved transportation and communication in India, there became like this sense of Indian nationalism, and eventually they're going to want the British to get out. So really, the putting them to work and building the railroads worked against the British eventually because it helped the Indians join together and become one nation.
And last but not least, we have the Opium Wars in China. So the context of the Opium Wars is that China isolated themselves from the rest of the world. They didn't really want the rest of the world to come in and trade. Remember when we were talking about the silver trade, we said that China really wanted silver, but that was all they wanted. They didn't really want any other products. Great Britain really wants tea, but they don't want to spend valuable silver on it. So they would rather trade for something. However, they have to figure out what the Chinese want, right? The law of supply and demand. Eventually, they find out that the Chinese really like opium. And opium grows really well in some parts of India that Britain controls, so it would work out perfectly for both of them. But they have a slight problem. Opium is illegal in China. And so they can't just openly trade opium. Therefore, you guessed it, they smuggle it in. And that starts an even bigger problem. The emperor really doesn't like this. First of all, the British are breaking the law by smuggling it in, and they're influencing his people to be lazy and high all the time, instead of actually being contributing members to the society. So it's a big problem for China. And eventually the British and the Chinese go to war over it, and the Chinese lose. They sign a treaty called the Treaty of Nanjing. As a result, China has to open up more ports to trade. Unfortunately, too much trade and the lack of silver currency and copper currency forced China to make paper money, and eventually is going to devastate their economy. The other problem is that unemployment is on the rise because products from the West are cheaper than what they can make them in China. Farmers also stop growing food because they want to make silk and grow tea in order to make more money. That makes the price of food skyrocket. Uprisings also start to happen because people distrust the Chinese government for making deals with the Europeans. Another problem is that foreigners and anyone who works for them are exempt from Chinese law, so crime rates raise. Eventually, the Second Opium War happens, China loses again, and is forced to pay more reparations and give up more. Intellectuals start to question the government, which will eventually lead to the Boxer Rebellion and wanting to kick out every foreigner from China, which eventually leads to the end of the Qing dynasty. On your Google document, we have an excerpt of the Treaty of Nanjing. Let's go check that one out.
Okay, so let's look at the Treaty of Nanjing. It says, Article 5, the government of China, having been compelled by the British merchants trading at Canton to deal exclusively with certain Chinese merchants, called Hong merchants or Kohong, who had been licensed by the Chinese government for that purpose, the Emperor of China agrees to abolish that practice in future at all ports where British merchants may reside. So basically, more open trade. And to permit them to carry their mercantile transactions with whatever persons they please. And His Imperial Majesty further agrees to pay to the British government the sum of $3 million on account of the debts due to the British subjects by some of the Hong merchants, or Kohong, who have become insolent and who owe large sums of money to the subjects of Her Britannic Majesty. So basically, they're saying they're compelled. That means they don't really want to do this, but they're opening up trade and they're going to pay reparations to the British. So the larger context of this, what causes the Opium Wars to happen, is that prior to this, the Chinese were restricting trade, right? And the thing was that the British are trying to expand their empire, right? And their sphere of influence. They want to be able to trade more. They want to be able to do it the way that they want to do it. Remember, they were unhappy with the fact that all the Chinese wanted was silver. And so this document is going to be able to force the Chinese to open up more ports, to open up the availability to the British so that they can expand their sphere of influence.
Okay, so that's an overview of the first part of period 5. Thank you for listening, and as always, if you have any questions, make sure and put them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a thing. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft. Kind of hard to say her last name. Okay. Under their monarchical power.